Hello there, everyone. Leif Torgerson here, and I'm going to talk about one of my favorite organisms in existence, Bombus bumblebee, and their unfortunate decline in the Midwestern United States. So what exactly is a bumblebee? Well, aside from being adorable, bumblebees are eusocial insects in the order Hymenoptera, family Apidae, genus Bombus. A queen will form a colony made up entirely of her own daughters, who eventually take on the non-reproductive tasks formerly carried out by the queen, including caring for young and the volitional gathering of pollen and nectar. The bumblebees are obligate mutualists of flowering plants. Both larvae and adults rely solely on the pollen and nectar output of flowering angiosperms for food. Now, this mutualism and the generalist nature make bombus bees excellent pollination vectors for a wide variety of plants and keystone species in every environment that they inhabit. The bumblebees are heavily cold adapted, hence their fuzzy appearance, and are most diverse in temperate and montane areas. Roughly 19 bombus species are extant in the Midwest, and bumblebees are native to all parts of the northern hemisphere and have been pollinating North American flora for at least 20 million years. They also have physiological adaptations, such as the ability to warm themselves via thermogenesis, and that allows them to thrive in places where other insects have a hard time in terms of thermodynamics, including the tops of mountains and the Arctic Circle, which is pretty incredible. On the left, we see an example of a Bombus impatiens colony, which in nature would be found in a mouse hole. In an anthropogenic setting, that might be found in an old boot, or if you're really lucky, the insulation of a barn that you're tearing down, which is where I first encountered them when I was younger. This colony, which is initially founded in the spring, will grow in size and worker count. Workers live about 2 weeks until the fall. And then the old queen will produce a cohort of reproductive offspring, so haploid males and diploid gynes, which are unfertilized queens. And the old queen and the entire old colony will die off. And the new queens will mate and burrow into the ground to overwinter, which is called quiescence, until they emerge next spring, and the whole process starts over again. On the right, we see an example of bumblebee thermogenesis, a hard word for me to say. By vibrating the large muscles in their thorax, bombus bees can generate body heat in order to fly, a process similar to mammals' shivering. And the shivering is metabolically taxing, but as long as bumblebees have access to food, they can keep themselves warm, which is really helpful when you live on top of a mountain, or in the Arctic, or here in Duluth, Minnesota. Bumblebees also use these powerful thorax muscles in order to carry out a method of pollination known as sonication, where they land on a flower of an angiosperm, and they shake and shiver their body in order to dislodge pollen. And this video is of a Bombus impatiens worker doing that outside of my house over the summer. Through use of sonication, bumblebees are highly effective pollinators of agricultural crops that evolved alongside them in temperate and montane environments, including blueberries, cranberries, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, raspberries, and apples. And you may be wondering, aren't the Sonication listed here South American? And yes, they are. Bombus migrated down to the Andes Mountains roughly 4.5 million years ago. In natural environments, bumblebees take their role as a generalist pollinator very, very seriously, and they act out that role as consummate professionals in their field, oftentimes a literal field full of flowers. So having established that bumblebees are awesome, I wanted to know, how have populations of Midwestern Bombus spp, quantified via increase or decrease in effective range and relative abundance, changed in the last 50 years, and why are these changes occurring? In order to look into this research question, I carried out a literature review of many sources, and I'm presenting those results here. Early on in my research, I realized that there are no Midwestern bumblebees. There are transcontinental bumblebees. Bumblebees have ranges that are huge. And so for the purposes of my research review, I covered all bumblebees that live in the eastern United States that can also be found in the Midwest. Two ubiquitous attributes of bombus research studies in the United States include the use of the museum specimen methodology and the relatively identical results of each of the flagship population studies listed on the right. Because bumblebees were not considered imperiled until the early 2000s, very little historical population data existed to compare contemporarily gathered results against in these field studies. So, in each of these studies, historic data was generated via compiling the location data and capture data of thousands and sometimes tens of thousands, almost into the millions now, of bombus specimens preserved in entomology collections and museums and universities around the United States. And many of these specimens are over 100 years old. And this is a real-world example of the importance of accurate and well-preserved insect collecting. And surprisingly, although all these flagship studies on the right that took place in different areas, Grigsby et al. Surveyed the state of Illinois, Cameron et al. Looked at the entire United States, an example. All these studies reported very, very similar results. The results of the 5 initial flagship studies form the basis of the Midwestern bombus chronological research pyramid, as I'm calling it. Later studies would continue to expand and unify historic databases by recording specimen data from an ever-increasing number of entomological collections around the U.S. Organizations, including the IUCN and the 𝘉𝘰𝘮𝘆 Conservation Society, would later use all this compiled data to create status reports and legal filings for bombus species, the status protections. And in the case of Bombus affinis, that led to them being protected by the federal government as an endangered species in 2017. And for the sake of brevity, on the next slide, I'll be reporting results from the IUCN status reports, as they're largely indicative of all the results as a whole. On to the sad part of this presentation. 7 of our Midwestern species are in decline, and 9 are relatively stable. The 5 species on screen in particular are reported as having significant changes in range and relative abundance in the contemporary time period, so basically 1990s and forward, versus the historic time period in nearly every published journal article I could find. The numbers reported here are taken from the IUCN Red List status reports, which were compiled by the IUCN Bumblebee Specialist Group, which largely consists of the authors of the flagship studies. And so we can really rely on this data. And so most of these reports were published in 2014. And the flagship studies themselves are now almost a decade old. And the Bumblebee Specialist Group recommended in 2018 that these values need to be updated. Losses in Bombus affinis, Bombus pennsylvanicus, and Bombus terricola, that these 3 species might even be worse than they were at the time that they were reported. But thankfully, we have some good news. Bombus impatiens and Bombus bimaculatus are living up to their genus name, and they are booming in the Midwest. And because all of the bumblebee species you are seeing here are generalist species, if the declining species up above should happen to be extirpated from an area or undergo an extinction event, which is probably going to occur, the stable and increasing species may be able to carry out enough pollination to maintain the same level of ecosystem services that are currently available, and that is at least a silver lining. And if we look at the loss of Bombus affinis in particular, this is the Bombus affinis range map as supplied by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Yeah, it's a staggering decline. Those tiny red dots are where they are currently extant. There's actually a population in the Arboretum at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so that's cool. But yeah, it's just an almost unthinkable loss. A number of variables have been indicated as causative factors in bombus decline, all of which are anthropogenic. One of these factors is climate change. Climate change can cause phenological discrepancies between flower bloom and bumblebee emergence in the spring, which causes death of colonies due to starvation. And recent evidence suggests that climate change may actually be threatening bumblebees at the physiological level, as stated in this model by 𝘉𝘰𝘮𝘶 et al. Over the vast majority of the United States, 15 to 25% of decline in bumblebee diversity is caused by climate change. The critical thermal maximum of a bumblebee is between 40 and 45 degrees Celsius, and the temperature that they try to maintain is 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit, and it gets a lot hotter than 86 degrees Fahrenheit these days in the summer, basically everywhere. So one easy way to help our local bumblebees is to leave some ground cover in your yard and provide them shade in the summer. Another factor of decline in bombus is the microsporidium parasite 𝘉𝘰𝘮𝘶. It had been widely stated throughout the bombus research community in the early 2000s that a deadly novel strain of this microsporidium had been introduced into wild bee populations by commercially farmed Bombus occidentalis imported from Europe. And while that is not the case, there are significantly higher incidence rates of 𝘉𝘮𝑚 infection that have been recorded in multiple declining species of Bombus, including Bombus affinis, over other species that are not in decline like Bombus impatiens, implying that the act of factory farming bumblebees has actively spread the pathogen, and some bees resist it, and some bees don't resist it. And this is highly plausible. So an easy way to stop the spread of 𝘉𝘮𝑚 is to not buy commercially raised bumblebees. Perhaps the most intuitive factor of bombus decline in the Midwest is changes in land use. While specific studies on effects of land use changes in the United States are rare, 𝘰𝘮𝑗 et al. Reported the extirpation of 4 species of bombus from the state of Illinois between 1940 and 1960, as well as massive decreases in relative abundance of many historically common species, including Bombus affinis, in that time period. And 95% of the formerly wild prairie land in Illinois has undergone either agrarian or urban land use changes, so it could be viewed as a worst case scenario for bumblebees. And it's kind of intuitive when you think about it. If you have no flowers, you have no bees, and if you have these massive fields of monocultures that only flower for a few days, well, you're not going to get the pollen nutrition that you need out of that, and the entire rest of the time period in this huge area, all the bees are going to starve because there's no flowers. And so what can we do about this? Well, if you have a massive yard or a yard at all, and it's largely a graminoid, like grass yard, that's a bee desert. There's no flowers there, outside of maybe some clover. So if you plant native plants in your yard, well, that'll support the bees, and it looks really nice. Perhaps the most nefarious cause of bumblebee decline in the United States is the use of neonicotinoid pesticides. So first used in the mid-1990s, neonics are a series of systemic pesticides that are absorbed into a plant and expressed in all of its tissues, including its pollen and nectar, and then directly target the arthropod nervous system. As of 2014, they were the most highly used group of pesticides in the world. The LD50 for a honeybee is 4 to 5 nanograms, and 1/100th of that exposure as a larva as a bumblebee will lead to learning disabilities in the adult bumblebee. The workers will gather pollen less effectively, they can't find their way home, they get lost in the field, and they die. And if we think about that number of 4 to 5 nanograms being the LD50 for a honeybee, 8 million pounds of neonicotinoids were used in this country in 2014 alone. That's an absurd number. As a result of this, the average American agricultural field is now 48 times deadlier in terms of its oral toxicity than it was in 1992 to all invertebrates. And neonics can now be found in over half of America's water bodies. And a very easy solution to this problem on a personal level is just to not use any pesticides at all in your life. It helps all insects, including Bombus and Apis bees. I know that the situation can seem dire and very depressing, especially concerning neonicotinoids, but lots of people care, and lots of people are working very hard to fix these situations and save our Bombus bees and all our varieties of bees. And with that being said, I'd like to thank all the UW Superior faculty who helped me along my way while I was at this institution. I had a really fun time there. I'd especially like to thank Dr. 𝘉𝘰𝘮𝘏. He taught me a lot about entomology, and I worked in his lab at 𝘉𝘰𝘮𝑣𝘶, and it was just a wonderful time. And also Dr. 𝘉𝑒𝑟 for putting up with all of my nonsense as I put this project together. So thank you for watching, and have a good rest of your day.